Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I want to talk about some of the consequences that I think are going to come as a result of Charlie Kirk's assassination and kind of a bit of the bigger picture based on what we know as of this moment. So I'm recording this on September 12th in the morning. The FBI just had a press conference where they identified the shooter as a 22-year-old Utahan, and they identified some different engravings that were on both spent and unspent bullet casings found at the crime scene. And at least I honestly didn't understand the references made on some of them, but at least one said, like, "Hey, fascist, catch." So it's clear that ideology plays a role in all of this. And I think a lot of people on social media are conflating ideology with political affiliation, and they're not one and the same, right? Like, just because you believe in, like, leftist ideology, like, not all Democrats are leftist ideologues, in much the same way that not all, like, Republicans are far right conservative, white Christian nationalists. So I think, like, our terminology has been skewed and really polarized to the extent where we're just assuming, okay, everyone who identifies with one political party believes in this, and everyone who identifies in another political party believes in that. And I think it's obfuscating what's actually happening. And I say this because, an example that comes to my mind is this individual who was perpetrated, or, came forward and confessed to the killing. It was reported on X that he was a registered Republican. And so all of a sudden, at least on X, it seems like everyone's like taking this deep sigh of relief, like, oh, it wasn't a Democrat. And I don't think people realize that political radicalization doesn't neatly fall along party lines. So just because he's may still be a registered Republican, and probably because it's likely he did grow up in a Republican household, in a more conservative household, it doesn't mean he wasn't radicalized, and it doesn't mean that whatever this leftist ideology isn't a problem. And so if we can't parse the ideology from the political affiliation, we're not going to be able to come to a conclusion from this. I think things will get worse before they get better. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today, is what Charlie's death really signifies in terms of where our country is going and what lies forward. Um, but kind of like what we're up against, and how we got here, because this is something I'm still thinking about myself, especially because I'm, only just a couple years removed from being not fully indoctrinated by leftist ideology, but certainly, part of it, or at least aspects of it. I wasn't all in on 100% of it. And that's why I was able to walk away, because I didn't buy the whole package of leftism, right? And so I could identify things I didn't believe with, that didn't align with me, and it was easy for me to remove myself from that ideology because of that. But there's so many more people who, because of the absolutist nature of the ideology, they are all in on 100% of what the ideology has to say. And I think that's where we're starting to see conflict, is you can't reconcile with those people. And the death of Charlie Kirk clearly proves that. I mean, Charlie Kirk was someone who was revered and highly regarded because he gave his opponents a microphone, he gave them a table to come to, and he was willing to negotiate and talk to them. So he was the one who extended the olive branch. He was the one who wanted to have conversations, and the same isn't true of the other side. They're not willing to listen to what these people have to say. And, a great example, I had a conversation with a liberal friend of mine about this, who avowedly does not like Charlie Kirk. And I asked them, I said, well, why don't you like Charlie Kirk? And, a couple things on Talking Point USA website. Okay, fine. But did you actually listen to anything that Charlie Kirk had to say? Well, no, but I don't like him. Okay, therein lies the problem. These people have come to conclusions about a person and their character without ever listening to what that person stood for, or how that person carried himself. And so if folks who are beholden to this ideology are unwilling to listen and give give anyone the time of day. Anyone who disagrees with them, the time of day isn't going to give them the audio time or the clicks or the presence on the internet, the traffic and whatnot. If they're not willing to give them that, to listen firsthand to what they have to say, there's no really helping them because they're only going to get a filtered interpretation of the world coming through places like the New York Times and NPR and all sort of captured mainstream media. And that's part of the problem is we have a media apparatus that has captured a large segment of the population and turned them against another part. And I'll dive through some of the snippets in this piece because I have some references here that I think will help. But this is basically a walkthrough of what I think happened with Charlie Kirk and why it's so significant. But one of the things I pulled here was just a screenshot from the New York Times, and the language they use here is so important. So you'll notice this is from I think yesterday. So it says manhunt underway for killer of Charlie Kirk, charismatic right wing activist. So right there, charismatic right wing activist. Okay, that right there, it like tells you how the New York Times portrays someone like Charlie Kirk. So if you're a cultured urban liberal who only gets your news from the New York Times, you're going to subconsciously become indoctrinated based on the language they use. And they had to issue a correction because in a previous report they had called him anti Semitic. And the problem with corrections is they give publications like the New York Times a pass to spread misinformation, malinformation, if you want to use RFK Jr.'s words, information that is avowedly incorrect, but then they can issue a correction and point to it later and say, "Here, we made up for it. We were wrong." But they still got the news out there, and the problem is someone who's quickly scanning and reading through the New York Times, they're not going to read through the correction, so they're just going to assume, oh well, he's an anti-Semite, he's this, he's that, and these people have never actually listened. They never sat and listened to a keynote that Charlie Kirk gave. They never listened to or watched a video, from one of his campus debates because it would have never come up in their algorithm, right? It's not something they're actively seeking out. It's not something that they're willing to engage with. And so the only information they are getting about this person is through a filtered lens coming from the New York Times, which, as you can clearly see, is politically motivated. Not even just biased, but politically and ideologically driven. And you can see it based on their choice of words and the language they use. And the language is incredibly important here because as we saw with the evidence from the shell casings, both here and in the Annunciation Catholic school killings as well, terminology like fascist and Nazi are being used. And this is rhetoric that has been pushed by the media for the last decade now, telling anyone who disagrees with the narrative, the ideological narrative that currently is being held by the left, anyone who disagrees with that narrative, anyone who challenges it, anyone who questions it, is a Nazi and a fascist. And now, as a result of Charlie Kirk's death, we're starting to see people come out of the woodwork suggesting that is justified, that killing someone who is a Nazi and a fascist is justified. And so that's why I titled this piece The Day Free Speech Died, because if I believe things that Charlie believed, right? I'm not saying I agreed with him 100%, right? There's things people are always going to disagree on, but for the most part, I agreed with a lot of what Charlie had to say. So if Charlie is a fascist and worthy of death because of his beliefs, I too am a fascist and worthy of death because of my beliefs. And so this is where I think we're at. And so I'm going to jump ahead. Again, this piece is just kind of breaking down, where I think we're going. And he was shot for not just for his beliefs, but the way he, carried himself and his whole platform and what he represented. So it wasn't just the assassination of a activist, if you want to call him that. It wasn't even just the assassination of someone who had political influence within culture and the political apparatus, even though he wasn't a politician or he wasn't a journalist. I want to be clear on that. He was a civilian like you and I, but he just happened to have a platform. But in killing him, the assassin also killed the style of debate that he was using. Now people are going to think twice about going to public forums where there could be a copycat, and it's likely there probably will be. And so people are going to start thinking twice about going to debates and having this style of conversation. And all Charlie did, like before he got to the point where he was drawing crowds as big as he did and had all these tents and stuff, all he had was a table. He had a table and he was like, prove me wrong, right? So you and I can go do that. Billboard Chris is another example. He's a guy that goes to all sorts of places and he challenges people on trans ideology. And all he does is he wears a sandwich board over himself. So any one of us could have done what Charlie did. I think Charlie was exceptional and he was very committed to what he did and he built an incredible platform. But what he represents is the type of free speech and the type of dialogue and conversation that you and I are free to engage in and can. So by assassinating him, they didn't just kill an influencer and someone who had a lot of influence, frankly, with young people. They killed the type of platform he employed and that he built and the style of debate he used to have conversations with other people. And so I think this, uh, honestly, I think this kills free speech. I think free speech is dead, and I I don't want to like say that we are going into another civil war, and in terms of like having a bloody conflict, like you saw in Rwanda, like you've seen in Sierra Leone, and other kinds of like modern conflicts, Syria, for example. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to be the outcome. Um, Sorry about the pups barking in the background too. Hopefully that's not picked up too much on the mic. But I don't think because of where we are, because both ideologies have fundamentally and divergent views and a completely different baseline of both reality and the moral framework through which they operate in the world. You can't reconcile those. So I wrote about this a bit in another piece I wrote in March called "Are We Already in a Civil War?" And I think we are, because we have, in a civil society like ours and a secular society, you're supposed to have like apolitical institutions, right? So, the court system, the press, the economy, right? You're supposed to have these non-political institutions that are supposed to adjudicate things on our behalf. So, the military, for example, the military is not supposed to be deployed for political purposes. Um, Judges aren't supposed to be political. Um, and yet that's exactly what has happened. Everything has become political. And so you can't trust the New York Times anymore. And you haven't for a while, but you can't trust the media, as embodied by, the New York Times, because they are using politically loaded language and they have a bias. You can't trust the legal system and thus the criminal justice system, because as we saw with Irina Zaritska's murder, it's very clear that every criminal gets 14, 15 chances, and the only way they're stopped is once they kill someone, right? So there's trust is completely gone in that, and other stuff before that too. Going after the J6 protesters like they did, how they went after Trump on the charges they did, while turning a blind eye to other folks doing the same thing. Letitia James in New York is going through a case right now with mortgage fraud. So the whatever corruption they tried to indict against Trump, like they're also doing as well, and turning a blind eye to that. So you can't trust that. And then of course you have state and municipal governments that aren't subordinating to the federal government. So the federal government is supposed to have a monopoly on the use of force. We have in the Second Amendment the right to bear arms as a check on that, and to make sure that the government does not devolve into tyranny, that it doesn't you know threaten us, as has been seen in other governments throughout history. But that relies on the states and municipal governments working within a federated system and a federal system like we have. And what we're seeing with the ICE raids and police actions and the use of the National Guard and resistance and insubordination from municipal governors is that they're not willing to play ball with the federal government. And so it's not even resistance at this. I mean, it is resistance, but it also signifies a breakdown of our federal system of government. Like if Washington loses control over cities and can't control what's happening in cities, like we don't have a country anymore. And then of course you're seeing what's happening in New York with the mayoral race. As Zoran Mamdani wins, he is a socialist. You cannot have a localized government that is socialist, that is overtly socialist, right? Uh, in a capitalist federal country like ours. Like they cannot coexist. They are mutually exclusive. And Sure, you can practice aspects of socialism on economically speaking on a localized level. You see this in churches all the time. You pay a tithe, and in return, if something, it's a pool of money, so if something happens to you, like, you can tap into your church community, and they'll pay some of the bills for you. That happened with my family a couple times growing up. So there are localized levels of economic socialism, but what people don't realize is socialism and capitalism are both economic systems, but underpinning those are political systems that make those economic systems work. So capitalism is about free enterprise and the ability to generate profit off of your work, off of innovation, off of, efficiencies, right? You are able to generate a profit, and that is predicated on private ownership, right? So if you cannot own something privately, capitalism does not work. So if you have a socialist government coming into power in New York City that isn't just implementing socialist policies, but is radically transforming the meaning of ownership, the Constitution comes into conflict with the local government, right, of New York City, and so that they can't mutually coexist. So I think I think we're going to devolve into a civil war because of this, because you have two political ideologies that are not they can't coexist. You cannot have a conservative ideology that has a defined moral framework and moral benchmarks on what is right and what is wrong, and clearly defined boundaries and rules, versus a very fluid, dynamic, constantly changing, subjective moral framework that is highly interpretive, right? Like, if one says murder is murder, and the other, it's up to your discretion, you can't have a legal system built on that, right? You can't have a legal system built on wishy-washy rules, and that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing that with criminal justice reform, and reasons why you had DeCarlos Brown Jr. out on the street and able to kill Irina Zaritska while she was just sitting on the train car trying to go home from her pizza shift, because you have a world view that is highly subjective, and you can't build a standardized uniform rule of law on top of that, and because you can't build the rule of law on top of that, you can't enforce it. So you have nothing, you have lawlessness. And so these two ideologies are combating with one another. I don't think we can amicably resolve our differences because we don't live in the same information framework, information world. We don't live in the same ecosystem anymore. We're not participating in the same public spaces. We're not spending money in the same areas. We're not shopping at the same stores. We're not listening to the same sources of information. And so we live in a very polarized world. And so I think this is going to reverberate into nationally, and it's going to lead to fragmentation. I don't think there's anywhere we can go from here. What did I say down here? Okay, yeah. So I don't think there's anywhere we can go from here in terms of like the status quo we're at now, in terms of like cohabitating and these different political ideologies, because one seeks to eradicate the other. And maybe this is my bias coming through, I don't know, but it appears to me that leftist ideology is more towards eradication of the enemy or the opposing viewpoint than conservative ideology. And I think the evidence I have for that is historically conservatism has been around for a lot longer. You didn't see, you saw revolutions in, obviously the United States and France in the 18th century, challenging the monarchy. But you didn't see revolutions and political movements that we saw once socialism came onto the scene in the mid 19th century. I think, the Russian Revolution, for example, very different in nature than the French Revolution, and obviously the government that came out of the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union, very different. And so throughout the 20th century, we have seen leftist ideology implemented, an ideology that defers to the state. So maybe different than the cultural ideology we're seeing in the U.S., where everything is subjective. You can feel however you feel and do what you want, and there's really anarchy that's underpinning it. The Soviet Union and socialist governments, communist governments of the 20th century, they were more in deference to the state, and more totalitarian in nature because of that. But we have evidence to show what happened. So Stalin got to power and he purged his enemies. He a complete purge, and that didn't just manifest in killing people. It also manifested in sending political opponents to the gulags and erasing them from public life and their prior existence. Same with the same things happening in China, right? You have camps of threats, political threats, and political opponents. People get disappeared. So this has happened before, and so you see that happening um, in leftist ideology governments. I don't know that there's an equivalent to that specifically in conservative governments, or and I don't mean conservative in like the Republican sense. I mean conservative in classical liberalism sense, liberty, deference to individual rights, respect for the rule of law, that kind of thing. Um, sure, like the United States has done some bad things, and countries founded on the moral values of the United States have done some bad things. I'm not saying the United States hasn't done anything bad, but the United States hasn't necessarily gone to the same levels that the Soviet Union did. Um, and so that's where I see the distinction there. So I see this as more genocidal. I see the leftist ideology as a fundamentally genocidal ideology that whose power is incumbent on eradicating opposition, and the only way to eradicate opposition is to kill it. And so I think that also is why like we can't continue to coexist in the same territorial spaces, because we've already made that leap, right? So we've canceled people socially, right? We've ostracized people that way. People have lost jobs because of their views. So there's been some economic conflict. Obviously, we've seen battles in the courts and the political system. So we've seen all the nonviolent hallmarks of this and progressing towards this direction. But now I think with Charlie Kirk's murder, a line has been crossed. We've crossed the Rubicon, and now violence is on the table in a way it hadn't been. And I think we were tiptoeing towards this, right? People firebombing, the governor of Pennsylvania's house, the Tesla takedown protests, obviously, the assassination too of the senator, the state senator in Minnesota. Well, like we've seen a escalation, to the point in time to get to where we are now. But I think Charlie's death signifies a fundamental change. Like we've reached a turning point that we can't go back from. And I do want to say this: a lot of people have brought up the Minnesota lawmaker's death, Melissa Hortman, and Charlie Kirk, and a lot of folks who do read the New York Times and who identify with leftist ideology have been saying, well, what about her? And I think there's a fundamental difference here. And I'm not saying her death is any less significant, especially because she was killed for for a vote she cast against providing healthcare for migrants in Minnesota. The distinction here is her death happened in the middle of the night in an intimate setting in her home. We learned about it after the fact, whereas Charlie Kirk's death was broadcast live for everyone to see. And even if you didn't want to see the shot that killed him, if you didn't want to see his death, like you didn't really have a choice because it was the only thing that came up on X within minutes of it happening. So this is like fundamentally different. And I don't think people really understand that, right? When JFK was shot, yeah, there were some witnesses, right? But there's Bruder film and controversy around that and all the conspiracies. So even that was in question. There were very few witnesses to MLK Jr.'s assassination, for example. But Charlie Kirk's was seen by millions of people. That video was seen billions at this point. I'll say billions. Everyone across the world saw it instantaneously in high definition. So we saw someone gunned down. And for young people, Gen Z and millennials, you know, we haven't grown up with an assassination yet, right? So like, this is our first experience with this, and so I think Charlie Kirk was also a big deal because he was relatable to a lot of young people. So you had younger everyone. A lot of people looked up to him, not just young people, but you had a lot of Gen Zers who looked up to him, and then myself, I'm 2 years younger or 2 years older than him. Sorry, I'm 2 years older than him. So I see a lot of myself in him. Not that I'm the same as him, obviously, but he was a father and he was a husband, and he was doing his thing. And I'm getting married soon, and I'm moving towards starting a family, and moving towards that phase of life. And I do commentary like this on the internet. I see a lot of myself in him, and to see someone who's a peer in terms of age, not in terms of social level, but in terms of age, gunned down like that, like it hits different. It hits different, right? Um, and to see someone who's not a political figure in the traditional sense, like if Trump had been, if the assassination of Butler had been successful, I think it still would have been painful, and I think it would have been catalyst for sure for civil war. Um, but at least it would have been understandable, or you could rationalize it at better, right? Like, okay, he is a contentious political figure. He was, the former president, and that at that point in time was running for office again. Like, there are qualifiers you can make to that. Same with MLK, same with JFK. Okay, contentious. People disagree with them, had enemies, all that kind of thing. But Charlie Kirk, again, like I was saying, he's someone who built a platform from the ground up, no different than anyone else who's done the same thing. He had an immense following and was very effective, and I think that's why the person who killed him, you know, took the opportunity to do so, because they saw him as a threat. But because he is relatable, because he is so relatable, and we all witness this, and this is the first time many young people have seen an assassination like this live on camera. I think that's why his death has gotten far more media attention, and has been far more impactful than the lawmaker's death in Minnesota. And of course, he has a huge legacy, right? Like, I think a lot of people connected with him, looked up to him, and even if you disagreed with him, he people who had a personal relationship with him have come on to give their testimonies of their experiences with him, and they have nothing but good kind things to say. And again, I'm not saying the lawmaker in Minnesota was a bad person. It's just there isn't that same public record, right? And so when you have someone of remarkable character who's gunned down in broad daylight, broadcast across the entire world, and the first time two generations are witnessing it, like, yeah, it's gonna hit differently. It's gonna hit differently. I digress, but anyways, I think I think we've this is part of the problem, is we've been escalating towards violence, and now we've reached the point where violence is possible. So at this point, I don't think civil war is avoidable, but I don't think it's going to look, like I said, like Syria or Sierra Leone or any other conflicts. I don't think people are going to be like going onto the streets and like hacking their neighbors. I do think some things are going to change though. So on the one hand, I think people are going to start migrating to different zones or different areas where there's greater political alignment. And I'm speaking from experience because I literally did this. I lived in DC, was born and raised in upstate New York, and I live in Texas now. And there's a reason I live in Texas. When I was during COVID, I traveled the country, and Texas was the freest and most open state I went to. It was the only state where like life carried on as normal. Yeah, I mean, people were wearing masks and they were mindful of one another. But it wasn't like Oregon, for example, where I was asked to produce my vaccine card before using a gym I was a member of. I was asked to produce my vaccine card that I didn't have at the time to sit down in a restaurant. In New York, after I finished up my road trip, I had to provide proof of vaccination in order to attend a concert. So I saw all this, I witnessed it, and I saw Texas had been rational, and people again were courteous and respectful, but it wasn't down your throat. You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to wear this mask, you have to be vaccinated. And there was none of that. So I saw the freedom there. Obviously, there's some other nice stuff about Texas too. Not paying income taxes is kind of nice, but I say that because we've already seen a demographic shift in the country, and I think this is going to exacerbate as part of the cultural civil war we've already been in for several years at this point. So to give you an example, I talk in here about California, but because of the impact of COVID, especially in California, and again, I can attest to this because I was in California during this time, people have left California. So about 196 companies have fled the state of California, including Tesla, Oracle, I think Hewlett Packard as well. So some significant ones. But then also they've lost almost 500,000 residents in just 3 years, from 2020 to 2023. And this is why there's been these reapportionment debates. Because since the last census, there has been a major demographic shift out of California. So, yeah, it makes sense to like have this conversation because why should California continue to have decisive, potentially left-leaning votes in the federal government when they no longer have the people to substantiate those votes, right? So that's why that's been happening. But I think California is a great example, and a lot of people who left California have resettled to Texas, and for a lot of them for the same reasons that I did. But I think we're going to see more of this, and I think this has been underway for a while. Some for economic reasons, but I think we're going to start seeing more and more political reasons. I think people are going to start leaving cities because the quality of life has declined and substantially deteriorated. Like, who wants to live in a city where you could get stabbed on the subway because you have a 14th, 15th, 16th arrest, career criminal who's just walking freely because they want to give them more chances, right? So you have that risk. And we see evidence of this because the National Guard has already been deployed in like the New York City subway, for example, to address that issue. You have stores that have fled urban areas because it is no longer safe for them to do business. You've seen Walgreens close in several cities, Target as well. Your ability to purchase things has declined. So a lot of urban stores now have plexiglass around everything. So you have to get an employee to come over and unlock the freezer case in a bodega just so you can get Ben and Jerry's. So not only is that not a good quality of life, but it limits your participation in the economy. So what happens if you do get a Zoran Mamdani elected as mayor, promises all this stuff, can't make up for it, and starts limiting and rationing how people access food. Well, you already have the infrastructure in place to limit how people access food. If you can't go to the grocery store or you can't go to a store and pick something up and put it in your cart and purchase it, like if there is a barrier to entry for you to do that, you are at the whim of whoever is controlling that business. And if they decide they don't want to sell to you, like they don't have to. If they don't want to open up a case to give you a piece of merchandise, they don't have to. So it's a slippery slope towards greater restrictions of freedom. So I think sane and rational people who see what's happening, and also there's the economic side, right? Like because of all of this, costs are going up, and the cost burden is being imposed on property owners in a lot of cities. I think I saw somewhere there's a $1 billion shortfall in Boston, and it's being distributed across property owners in Boston, which is already an incredibly expensive real estate market. So you're seeing all this. So I think rational people are going to be like, okay, like they're going to tax me more. I'm going to have to pay more for a lower quality of life where I do not have the freedom to do as I please. So why am I still going to live here? So I think people are going to start moving, and they're going to start self segregating. And again, another example of evidence of this, and I did a video about this, but it's the return to land movement. So it got quite a bit of attention in July over the summer because a Sky News USA crew went and broadcast them and told them how awful and racist they were. But I think in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination and Irina Zariskid's murder, I think this is pretty founded. People were criticizing them for wanting to reinstate Jim Crow in the South, and the reality is, in a lot of places, white conservatives do not feel safe, and we have a body count to prove this. So there's a good reason why people are migrating to communities like this, and based on what they've reported, that this group is planning on to expand into Missouri. They've had a lot of interest. So it's clear this isn't just like a fringe thing. It's clear people want to get out of where they're living, and they want to find safety. So I say all of that because I think as people migrate and move to different areas, it's going to lead to a natural fragmentation of the United States. So if DC, DC and the surrounding areas, 99% Democrat, and then they lean more leftist, they're going to end up getting to a point where they're going to where conservatives aren't going to go there, and they're going to kind of go their own way. So it's going to reach a point. Well, why don't we just govern ourselves, right? Like, why do we need this federal government? Same with California, same with Chicago, same with New York, right? I think that we're going to start seeing potentially secession, and there's been talk of this for a while now, and I think it's possible this could uh, end up being the case, especially if these cities continue to be insubordinate to the federal government. They continue to resist federal law enforcement. And if the president cannot maintain a federal monopoly on the use of force over these jurisdictions, if there's a challenge to the federal government's rule and supremacy, I think that's when we'll definitely see things break down. But the other thing I think is happening is so we're gonna see movement and geographic territorial fracturing. But then the other thing that's happening is socially and economically, and we are starting to see this where people are being fired now for things they shared. So a good example, MSNBC held a had a video where some guy was like, oh, he probably got shot for celebratory reason. It was like celebratory gunfire is what shot Charlie Kirk, and then insinuating he deserved it because of his violent rhetoric. So MSNBC quickly had to apologize, and they since fired that commentator because of it. But he's not the first one. So there's a website that's been created called Expose Charlie's Murderers, and I'm not sure where they're getting. I think people are self-reporting it because I've seen this on X as well. I've also seen reports that people on 4chan are basically scraping social media looking for people like this. But people are effectively being publicly doxxed for writing posts that basically mock Charlie Kirk's death. So these are some examples. So this person, very pro here, because the joke here is not, it's not even a joke, but the thing is here, like, Charlie Kirk was pro Second Amendment, so people are celebrating because he like got what he deserved, and then like posting gruesome pictures of his death, and then things like "Please be dead." You're seeing this. People have been producing images and T-shirts, and selling them with graphic images on it. Um, you know, people just posting all sorts of things. Um, like making a mockery of it. And so we've started to see public naming and shaming. And there have been several employers who have made decisions on this. And it's been all over X where, a school district has come out with statements, be like, we got a report that one of our employees has said X, Y, and Z about Charlie Kirk. We don't agree with this. They've since been terminated. And so I think this is going to further push us towards the cold civil war. I think we're already in, and could create more violence because people are going to have to be held. I mean, that's the only way. You have to be held radically accountable for your actions, and this is going to push, I think, people further to the extremes because of this. And so I don't think we're at a point where we can reconcile these differences. I think for all the reasons I've said, we kind of live in our own little bubbles, and those bubbles have a unique, now not unique, but they have their own belief system, their own economies. Because I don't think these people I don't know, I don't think that businesses like this, people like this, are going to be employable. Like, they're only going to be able to be employed by people who agree with the ideology, right? And so I think we're going to see a bifurcation in the economy and economic participation. And proof of that is the Bud Light campaign with Dylan Mulvaney. Bud Light screwed around, and they sure found out. So I think you're going to see more of stuff like that, which is going to push people into different economies, different employment situations. People are going to obviously physically move for personal safety, but also to places that more align with their values and their beliefs. Like, if you believe in the rule of law and think criminals should be held accountable, you probably shouldn't be living in a big city right now, especially one with a second chance legal system, right? So people are just going to move, and I think naturally the country will fall apart because of that, because these ideologies are incompatible. These ideologies are incompatible. They cannot coexist. Um, so and I don't think the political system will be able to fix this because if let's say JD Vance runs the next election and wins, he will be part of Trump's legacy. So he will be Orange Mad Bad Part Two. And if the left wins, it's going to be more of what we saw during 2020, where speech was suppressed, people were deplatformed, and people were imprisoned. And I think that will expand. And so I, I think both sides see the other as an existential threat. And so that combined with the violent rhetoric that has made murder permissible and has gotten us to this point where someone would scrawl "Hey fascist" catch on a bullet and then shoot it at Charlie Kirk, I think tells you all you need to know that this is not a one-time incident. This is where we're going. So I'm not saying that to advocate for violence. Of course, I don't advocate for violence. I'm just saying what I think is and where we're going because I think it helps prepare us for the internal strife that is I think about to take off because this isn't sustainable, right? Like you can't continue living in a country pretending like the First Amendment exists when it clearly no longer does. Um, so where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? What does this mean? So I want to play a clip. Alex Jones had reposted this, but this was originally from Charlie Kirk's sit down with Tucker Carlson earlier this summer, and I think this is really important.
Political radicalism needs a catalyst. Political radicalism does not come out of peace, prosperity, rising wages, stable families, church attendance, and happy people. Happy people, grateful people do not get behind Vladimir Lenin, and they certainly don't get behind Chavez or Castro.
That's right.
People that own nothing, that feel like their property is diminishing, or they don't have property, or their dollar is diminishing in value, they start to look for alternatives. And so the political project in front of us as conservatives should be, how do we actually de-radicalize the country in the next couple of years? That's my obsession. And that's why I say I try not to think about all this other stuff because it just, it's so much brain space. My number one obsession is I know what is coming next. Political radicalism.
Okay, so I think he's kind of laid it out, and he in this clip it kind of gives us the torch that we need to carry on in honor of his memory and in his legacy. And we have to figure out how to de-radicalize the country. And so to figure out how to de-radicalize the country, we have to figure out where radicalization is coming from. So X has been filled this morning, obviously, with news about the assassin being caught and detained, and he's in, I believe, FBI or federal custody right now. But it was a 22-year-old, and a lot of people on X were posting, did education play a role in this? Did he become radicalized in college? And I think there's something to that because this kid, for all intents and purposes, grew up in what looks to be a normal middle-class family. I think his parents are still married. At least that's what it appears. Father was a sheriff, so part of law enforcement. He grew up around guns. So just based on that alone, I'm going to suspect he probably grew up in a conservative household. And based on what I said in the beginning, how he was already a registered Republican, probably that was what he registered in when he was 18, so before he went to college. And so something happened from the age of 18 to the age of 22 where he got to a point where killing someone he disagreed with was permissible to him. And so that had to have happened during the span of time he was in college. And so I've been thinking more about this because this is what Charlie did. This was his legacy is he went into university campuses and debated people. And as I've kind of extricated myself out of leftist ideology, this has been something I've been racking my brain with. It's like, okay, where did I learn all of this? Where did this come from? I've talked about in previous videos and other writings, things around feminism, right? I never picked up a feminist piece of literature. I never actually engaged with the thought, yet I somehow found myself believing that I was paid less than a man simply because I was a woman, right? Palestine. I, wrote my senior thesis on defending Palestine. I've been to the region multiple times. I have firsthand experience traveling there, doing some interesting stuff, and that's something I've wondered how. When I was in high school in upstate New York, I knew about Israel because one of my Jewish classmates had done Birthright. but that was about it, right? I didn't know anything else. I knew because the second Intifada was happening in the early 2000s, so I would see it on the news, right? But it was over there. It was part of the violence, and then obviously the Iraq War started. So the Middle East was always framed as like this violent place. So I didn't really know much about Palestine. And then somehow I went to college. And then between the start of college to the end of college, I was a pro Palestine advocate who wrote my senior thesis on Palestine. And my graduation cap, I even drew a map of Palestine and said, freedom for Palestine, right? So I was a Palestine protester before the Palestine protesters today. So I say that because now I'm looking at this generation of Gen Zers who has been doing the same stuff I was doing, except to a much more different degree. We had debate and discourse when I was in college. Argued with people, brought speakers in. We never. As part of different groups on campus, and we never barricaded ourselves in the library. And I can never even think of doing that. It was never violent. But how did someone like me, a white Christian girl from upstate New York, become a pro Palestine advocate, and how over the last decade did pro Palestine advocacy at colleges turn from constructive dialogue and discourse to barricading yourself in a college library and to committing acts of violence and violent protests? Like how did that happen? Trans and gay stuff, right? Like in high school, I had a gay teacher. I had classmates who were gay and they were openly gay, and it was fine. Like this was before gay marriage was permitted, sure. Um, no one ostracized them. They just did their thing. No one cared. So and then of course in college, the LGBTQ community had their own group on campus, no different than the Asian Pacific community, no different than the Pan-Hellenic people. Like they had their space. So how again in a decade have we gone from just normal people having like just a different identification to rejection of biology, cancellation of people who affirm that there are two sexes and one cannot become the other, and the radical affirmation of different identities, not even just like LGBTQ anymore. It's just like all sorts of sub identities within this. How do we go from that to where we are now? So it's very clear there. You can see the through line. It is very clear there has been a radicalization of youth for much of the last decade now. And so the question is like, where is that coming from, and why? And that's what I've been trying to figure out. How like no one overtly radicalized me in college, right? No one overtly said, you must learn about Palestine. You must be a feminist. You must be an ally with gay people. Like, no one ever said that to me. There were obviously like groups on campus, like Students for a Democratic Society in America and all those different groups. So there were, student groups on campus. But no professor like sat in front of a class to my memory and like overtly said certain things to make me think a certain way. Now, they did use certain terminology on things, right? So my international relations professor and the head of the department would always talk about how we were global citizens, right? So in that regard, her language and the conversations she directed around global citizenship and the push for us to be of the world and not be Americans, that obviously kind of would explain how we got to the point where we're at today, where we're treating non-citizens as citizens, right? So I can see that, but there was never like an explicit point in time that I can remember where I actually learned something. So where is it coming from? And the thing I've been coming back to is the media, the media, and then the relationship with the media and the education system and the people who then join the education system. And I think that might be where it's at. So, one of the things we had at college, and maybe you can relate, is we have access to the New York Times for free. So I used to hoard New York Times newspapers. And to me, reading the New York Times in my mind was a signal that I was a educated member of society. So I would always hold on to I would get them. I never had time to read them, but I would have stacks of New York Times newspapers in my room. And maybe on the weekends I would do it, but I would take one to a coffee shop and go and read it, right? So that was always, I associated New York Times readership with intellectualism and like high society, if you will. And and I think the media had to do something with it because up until I went to college, I was consuming Fox News. I would watch. I grew up in a conservative religious household, but I went to public school, right? So there was balance. I wasn't like crazy, isolated conservative, but grew up in an evangelical Baptist household. I would watch Fox and Friends in the morning, and then I would watch Glenn Beck. And I remember I bought one of his books, and I don't know when this happened. I remember at one point he said, Glenn Beck said in his show something about progressives and talking about how bad progressives were. And in that moment, I realized I was a progressive. This would have been my senior year in high school. And so I stopped watching him at that point because I was like, oh, I'm a progressive. And I think I associated progressiveness with progress and being good and moral virtue. And then once I got to college and had access to the New York Times, I associated the media and the media I consumed with moral virtue. And as I stopped going to church and stopped participating in religious institutions that I had previously participated in, that ecosystem kind of replaced my moral framework where I believed like if because I wanted to be a member of the expert class, I wanted to be welcomed in that part of society, be part of the intelligentsia, if you will. I had to do what they did, and if they read the New York Times and listened to NPR, I had to as well. And so I think that's how the radicalization I think is gaining a foothold. It's people who feel like they want to belong in certain segments of society are consuming the media that enables them to be a part of that segment of society. So obviously if you want to be respected, you can't listen to Alex Jones or you can't publicly admit it because Alex Jones doesn't have social value within the parts of society that the majority of people who are engrossed in leftist ideology, it doesn't give them the social capital that they need to advance in their careers and their lives. It doesn't have social value. It has ostracization. So I think that's kind of what's been happening, and I think there's also been some obviously there is the ideology piece within the education system, and teachers are sharing things with their students. Um, so I think that is priming them for it. You're priming kids, in the high school level, and then once they get to college, once they're separated from their parents, they're separated from their moral foundation. If they grew up in the church, they don't have that to fall back on anymore. I think it's easier to replace the moral values and the parameters of one's upbringing with something completely different. And I think that different thing is what is being transcribed in the media and how people are being told to behave and the association of that moral system with social value that they can then leverage to then expand their career, expand their social network, gain influence, whatever. And so I think the two are intertwined, but I do think the education system is playing a role in all of this, not just the college system, but I also think other parts as well. So I saw this on the Persistence, Scott Pressler's feed on X. I think this is quite remarkable. So they've been posting stuff about like doxing people, the same as the Expose Charlie Murders website, but exposing people who are posting things. And so I just searched school because these had come out, these posts had been kind of interspersed throughout the rest of the tweets. But you can see here, so this person is a guidance counselor. And this person is a teacher, and these are all people who have written bad things about Charlie Kirk's death. I don't know what this person said. I don't know. Okay. But this person, I think this person might have been fired. She was hoping to wake up to an obituary. Okay, so that was a bad thing. So people are just like celebrating his death. So just has this account has been recording all these different educators, and so if these are the people who are responsible for, okay, these are the people who complement the the upbringing of kids in home. So if young people are the future citizens of our society, they are brought up at home by their family, but they're also brought up by the school system because that's where they spend the majority of their day. So you have two sources of instruction. You have home and you have school. And depending on your home, you might also supplement with church or some other religious affiliation. Okay, so if you're not getting home and you're only getting school, and this is what you're being filled with, I think this is why we're seeing increased radicalization of people on, or of people on towards the left, because you have like school teachers who are sharing things with them. And again, like I can't define a school teacher who overtly told me to be a cultural Marxist, but I can tell you a school teacher that, or a college professor who told me to be a global citizen, right? And so if you map the relationship you have with your teacher with your future success and your desire to establish yourself and have a good career and a good professional future, and you recognize that your teachers are the gateway to that, and you need peer approval within your school ecosystem in order to get the social capital you need to also be successful. I think this is kind of, there's like a reinforcing mechanism where if you challenge the narrative and you challenge the assumptions, you're going to be ostracized. You're not going to be welcome. And I think biologically we've evolved to want to be part of the tribe. So people are going to choose leftist ideology if they think it'll be a means to their future success than to challenge it. And so that's why I think we're seeing this play out today, because as we saw during COVID, there were actual consequences to challenging it, right? Like people were deplatformed, people were censored, people lost jobs. And now we're seeing that the pendulum swinging the other direction. These same people on the other side now are being punished for the things they said about Charlie Kirk's death. Um, and so I think it has to do with the school system. And I was reflecting on this as well when I was writing this morning. But I studied in college, so I studied international relations, political science, and history, and Middle Eastern studies. And so one of the things I focused on was like Islamic fundamentalism, political Islam, and trying to understand like how people got radicalized. So one of the research papers I did in college was trying to understand the motivations for suicide bombers. I was really interested in that and trying to understand, basically trying to understand how 9/11 happened, right? Like how do you get to a point in your life where you're willing to surrender your life in an act of political violence? Um, and so I studied all of that, and so part of that was obviously learning about Islam as a political ideology. And one of the things that is important to understand about that is education plays a huge role. So the Qataris and the Saudis are well known to be funding education programs and public schools across the Middle East. And so their textbooks are what kids read. And I lived in the Middle East, and so I acquired a history book because I was curious, and I still have it. And I just want to see what they were learning. And it was, about this thick, and there were maybe 2 pages, for example, on World War II. And that was it. And so, like, it made me wonder, okay, what are these kids actually learning? But uh, a lot of people who study political Islam and look at that, they understand there's a relationship between the education system and who's funding it and what they're actually learning. So, because the Qataris and the Saudis are funding it, and they are known to have a more conservative view of Islam, which includes, punishing infidels like you and I, that is what proliferates across the Middle East. So then, if you like Charlie Kirk was saying in that clip with Tucker Carlson, if you don't see a future for yourself, you're not married, you don't have you don't have property, the dollar's worthless, you can't get a job. If your social and economic situation um, deteriorates, then you start seeing the radical option as the right option. And I suspect that's kind of what we're seeing now. We're seeing kind of the same exact thing happening, but with leftist, cultural Marxist ideology, where you have a generation of young people now who have nothing, no prospects, no hope, no future of ever getting married and having kids, settling down, and owning a home. Like the version of the American dream that Charlie promised and believed in is gone, and I think we all know that. But I think that makes it easier to radicalize someone, and then if they've been primed throughout their education, so high school and then into college, it takes a spark, yes, to ignite, and it's going to ignite differently for different people. I don't know, for we hopefully we'll find out, but at some point this kid grew up in what appears to be a loving household with a, a healthy relationship, I presume, with guns. I think I read somewhere that he was a hunter. His father, obviously, law enforcement. So, a good understanding and respect of the rule of law. So, grew up in that, and then got to a point where he murdered a political opponent. So something happened, and I think a combination of the education with the socioeconomic realities around him may have brought him to the brink and past a point of no return for him individually. Um, and, I think a lot of people just want a name for themselves. They want the fame and the recognition. And for better or for worse, that's been the legacy of the Columbine shooters. There's been so many copycats after them because everyone remembers their names. And so people, and shooters in their manifestos have said this, like, it's a way for them to, even if it's an infamy, it's a way for them to live on forever. So this kid, of course, he's done that, right? He's done that job. He will always be known as Charlie Kirk's assassin. We all know Jack Ruby's name, right? So, um, Lee Harvey Oswald. We're taught that in our history books, so it's not unreasonable to assume that in a generation from now, like my kids will be learning about have a history book where Charlie Kirk's assassination is referenced and Tyler Robinson's name comes up with it. So for better or for worse, he got the legacy he probably could not have gotten on his own. Um, and it's an unfortunate circumstance that he did so. But I think this is where it's coming from. So just to kind of wrap it up, I think this is where we're going. I think we are already in a civil war. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think we have irreconcilable differences. I don't think that our existing political institutions can solve those differences for us. And I think because we live in a radicalized political environment, I don't think and because effectively free speech has been killed, and this idea of amicable constructive dialogue was killed with Charlie Kirk. I don't think we can come to the table anymore. So I think this is just going to have to play out naturally. I think it's going to lead to, unfortunately, uh, more death, which is not good. But I think it is what it is. And I think people are going to move, and we're going to start seeing the physical consequences of the cultural civil war that we're currently in. I think that's going to start playing out, especially as progressive elections from here on out become incredibly more contentious, and people are going to move to safe havens where they can find the security and the stability they need to carry out their lives. And I think it will take at least a generation to purge this ideology from the education system. And I think we're heading in that direction, right? You're seeing record numbers of people who are pulling their kids from public schools. They are pulling they're homeschooling their kids. And then obviously AI is changing the value proposition of college. So I think more and more kids will stop going to college and they'll start going to trade schools. So I do think there's hope. I don't think this is like completely lost, but I do think we're in a massive transition period that is going to be incredibly uncomfortable. And I think we're in it. I've talked about this for a while, but I think we're entering it. I think we're in it affirmatively now. And so I think for the most of us, I think life will carry on as normal. Um, but I think it's to be aware of what's happening and understand where we're going and what we're working towards. And so I think, you know, it's important to honor Charlie's legacy, uh, understand the operating environment we're in. So your operating environment might be different than mine, just based on where you live, who your family is, who you associate with on a regular basis. If you have to be nice at your job, so you don't get fired, like you gotta do what you gotta do, and I totally understand that. But at the same time, I think people are going to need to be held radically accountable, and we're starting to see that with, people's posts being doxxed and their employers being contacted and businesses being doxxed on X. I don't think this is going to be tolerated for any longer. So we're starting to see that. And so I think this will continue to play out culturally, and things will get tense, even more tense for a period of time. But yeah, I think that's where we're at. And I hope I'm wrong, but I think the United States will fragment and we will have two countries or multiple countries even that coexist on a single continent, as you see, in Europe, as you see in Asia. But I think each of those countries will have a different ideology. I don't think you will have, you can have the America as we know it coexist with a leftist ideology that is inherently genocidal in nature and is an affront to the free speech and Second Amendment and all of the rights and protections we are guaranteed in the Constitution. Like, you either have what's written in the Constitution or you don't. And it's clear at this point that folks who adhere to leftist ideology are undermining the freedoms that are within the Constitution, and then the media environment has been spun to make them see as if the opposite is true, right? That if Trump is the one who's trying to suspend the Constitution and he's a fascist, I think rational people know that's obviously not true. If Trump wanted to take over the United States, he's had plenty of time to do it. And frankly, I think he surrounds himself with enough good people that they wouldn't even let that happen. You have to have a lot of buy-in to get that to happen, and I think there's a lot of good people who are on his team. So I don't think that would happen. Yeah, so I think that's where we're at. I'd be curious to know where you agree, disagree, and if you see things going forward a little bit differently. I don't have a timeline. I don't know like how long this will last, or when there'll be a decisive conclusion to this. I think the decisive conclusion will be when one ideology wins over another, and that can be within a territory. So that could be a city purging itself and segregating or seceding from the federal government, and no longer being part of the United States. That would be a defeat, if you will, of the ideology. It doesn't necessarily have to be death per se, but that obviously is an option too that I think we have to be mindful of cognizant of, and look for the signs that we could be heading in that direction. So we are prepared in case that happens. So I think that's where we're at. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are. If you agree, disagree, have different interpretations, and any thoughts you have on how do we de-radicalize people? How do you get someone who is in a New York Times information environment, and how do you get them to see the world as it is, not as the New York Times presents it to be? And then how do we hold the media accountable? And I'm not saying like we need to, hang them from their, the streets and have, that like a French Revolution style accountability. I'm just talking about like these people are held in positions of esteem. They have social clout and power. They're respected. How do we reduce their role? How do we do to the mainstream media what the mainstream media did to people like Alex Jones? Made him seem to be a crazy, kooky conspiracy theorist. Like how do you reduce the social credibility of an entire group of people? I think, and in that way hold them accountable. Because as long as they're able to freely print whatever they want, for example, calling Charlie Kirk an anti-Semite and then offering a soft correction later on, how do you hold journalists like that if they're never going to be held they're never going to be held to account for that, right? They're not going to lose their jobs because they've issued the correction, right? They're not going to lose their jobs, and then they're going to show up places, and because they have the New York Times press badge, people are going to let them walk in freely, and they're going to be highly sought after because of that. So how do we change the relationship, the civilian relationship with the press, so that it no longer has the power and prestige that it currently does? Because I think once it loses that, the people who are in the mainstream media won't have the social capital anymore to manipulate the facts the way they have. As long as they have social capital and they have clout and they can leverage it for their own careers, I think they'll continue to do so. So I think we have to figure out how to give them the Alex Jones treatment, if that's a good way to put it. Like how do you reduce their stature in society? I think that's an interesting question as well. All right, that's what I got for you. Thank you again for watching. I know this is heavy stuff, and obviously, I think a lot of us are still kind of trying to figure out what even just happened. Like trying to make it make sense. Because this is a big deal. It's a very big deal, and it's not something to take lightly. So I thank you for watching. Also, hopefully my audio is better. I'm still trying to like figure all this stuff out, so I apologize if the audio is better. And I've been tinkering with the image size as well. I'm not sure if it'll fit on mobile the same way as it does desktop. So hopefully that I can figure that out soon. So I apologize for that. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.